In this exercise, we're going to work on our patch pockets. Patch pockets are sewn directly on top of the fabric on the outside of the garment. We have a curved with a flap. This flap here goes with this pocket here. And we have a western with a flap. And this will go here. So I have this other piece here, and this is your garment. Anything that says garment, we're going to pretend this is actually your full garment. And I have drill holes here. So these need to be punched open so that you can mark a pencil mark through or a pen mark through to the fabric, so that this is where we know to place the pocket. So we're going to need 2 of these because we have two pockets. For the pocket flaps, we're going to need to cut 2 of each of the pocket flap and then 1 out of fusible. For the fusible, I like to use this Pellon EK130 Easy Knit interfacing. This is good for lightweight to midweight fabrics. However, you can layer this so if you need it for something a little bit heavier. The nice thing about this is that it's a knit, and so it rolls with the fabric. When I cut this out, I'll talk to you a little bit more about this. So I'm going to get prepared to cut all my pieces out. I'm going to lay the fabric out, actually single layer. So we'll practice cutting in this one. Even though we could double it over to make it a little bit easier, I want to practice cutting. So I don't have a selvage on this side, so I'm going to do my pull test. I get some pull here, stretching a little bit, and I don't get any stretch on this side. So this must be my straight grain. So I'm first going to do the garment pieces. So line this up. Do your best to check the grain line that is going in the direction of the straight grain. I'm going to use my pencil and I'll trace around. Let me weight this. Okay, that's all traced. Don't forget to mark your punch holes. So I've marked those. And now I need a second one. So I'm going to line this up right next to this. Weight it. And then mark the drill holes. And I'm done with this pattern piece. So let's see if I can get the pockets below. Oh, that's a little bit too short, so I'm actually going to do my pocket flaps down here. I'm using this bottom line as a cut line. Now on your pocket flaps, don't forget the notches. This is your seam allowance. I get a second one down here, a little short, so I'll do the other one here. Again, I'm going to use this line right here, put the pattern piece there, and line it up along this bottom line here. That one's good. Let's see, can I do this? No. So I'll put my other pocket, my western pocket flap here, using this line here and this line here. And the notches. And I need one more. I'm actually going to put this right next here using this line right up here. And looking like I'm lining it up here right. Don't forget these notches again. Okay, so my pockets have the garment and the pocket flaps. Now all I need is one of each of these pockets. So I'll move this over a little bit. So I'm going to line this up here on this edge, here on the previous garment spot, lining it up here at this corner and on that line on the side. And then I can trace from my pocket. And again, don't forget your notches on the pocket. And here on this side, I'm going to line up the edge of the pocket here with the previous pocket line. Hold that in place. Trace all the way around. And then up here at the top. And then mark my notches for my pocket. Now these are all the fabric pieces that I need to cut. So I'm going to cut those out. Now that we have all of our pieces cut out, I have the 2 flaps for each of the pockets, each of the pocket, and each of the garment. So I'll set these aside now. I'm going to grab the pocket flap patterns really quick, because now I'm going to be using the interfacing and cutting 1 each of the interfacing. Now the interfacing has a rough side and a smooth side. The rough side is the side that has the glue on it. So if you're working with fabric that has different sides to it, this is actually the same kind of all around. So if I cut it this way or I cut it this way, it's not going to make much of a difference. But if you have a left and a right side that are different shapes, you're going to have to make sure that you cut it on the correct side. So I'm just going to roll a little of this out. And with this interfacing, we should know that there is a weave to it. So this is a knit interfacing, and it does have some stretch to it. So if you look closely, you have lines going up and down once you start looking at it. We're going to pretend that the side is the straight grain, and we're going to cut the pockets with the grain line parallel to the side. Your grain line still runs the length of this interfacing. So we want to make sure that we're actually still cutting the best way that the interfacing is going to be used in the garment. So I'm just going to lay this here. I think I will weight it, and I will carefully trace around so I can see where I'm cutting. This interfacing likes to stretch a little bit as I'm drawing. I don't have to worry about the notches on this because it's going to be fused to the pieces that have the notches. Okay. Trace the other one right next to it. Using its previous line, I'm kind of still following the top straight edge line. And I'll trace this out. Okay. Now, and I'm actually just going to cut this little piece off. Roll the interfacing up. Always roll it nice, fold it nice and neat, because your interfacings do get wrinkled, but you can't press them flat because it has glue on it. Okay, I'm going to separate these pieces now. Alright, so there are my 2 interfacing pieces, and I'll bring the other pieces back over. So here's my curved pocket flap, my western pocket flap, my western pocket, my curved pocket, and then my 2 garment pieces. So now that I have everything cut for my pockets, I'm going to use my marker and I'm going to identify the face side. Okay, so that's great for those. Now remember that you have 2 drill holes here, and I have 2 dots here and 2 dots here. This is for the placement for where we're going to place our pocket when we actually have our pocket ready to go. So I'm just going to make sure that I can see those a little bit better. Those are going to be covered anyway. Okay, so my garment parts and the patch pockets are done. Now let's talk about the pocket flaps. So we have the fusible, and the fusible is going to be fused to the wrong side of the top pocket flap. So if we were seeing this, let me get this really quick. So if your pocket was sewn on like this and your pocket flap comes over this, this top part of the pocket flap is the piece that you want to fuse. So we're still going to use squiggly lines for that. We're going to use a different type of line for the under pocket. So I'm going to separate these two here. These two are going to be my top pocket, and this is going to be the face side of the top pocket flap. And what I'll do is I'll go and place the fusible. So the rough side goes on the wrong side because that's the side it's going to be glued to. So now this is my top pocket flap for the curved. Turn this over. Rough side goes to the wrong side of the top pocket flap. Now this is going to be the under flap. It's going to be the part that's underneath, and you're not going to see that. So what I'm going to do, instead of squiggly lines, I'm going to make little crosses. So I know that when I sew this, this is going to be the under side of the top pocket. And if I had it sewed here on top, you would see the underside. It's just a way to designate which pieces are the top and under for the time being. So now we're going to actually use the iron to fuse the interfacing to the pocket flap, and then we'll be ready to go to the machine. Okay, so we're ready to work on our pockets. We have a western pocket, and then we have a curved pocket. We'll do these separately, but in the beginning here we have some preparation we can do together. So we need to fuse the top pocket flaps. So let's I'll remove the other pieces from the pressing mat. The pieces that we don't need right now. Now remember, as previously mentioned, you have a top pocket flap, you have an under pocket flap, and then you have the fusible, and the fusible is going to go on the wrong side of the pocket flap. So I can take the under pocket flaps away as well. Now I'm going to fuse to the underside. So this is the face side. Turn this over, we'll turn this one over. And remember that your fusible has a smooth and a rough side. The rough side goes down to the wrong side of the fabric. And I'm going to use a press cloth. This press cloth is basically another piece of muslin, although this is a white bleached muslin, and I just wanted to use that so you could see the contrast so there would be no confusion. It's always a good idea to use a press cloth so that some of the glue, sometimes it can seep through your fusing and can actually go onto your iron. So it helps keep the iron clean as well. You could also use a piece of muslin on the bottom of your press mat if you like. I'm not going to worry about this. Has a Teflon surface so that I can actually clean it off pretty easy. So I'm going to cover my pieces with the press cloth, and then I'm going to use a nice hot iron, and I'm going to press this probably 5 to 10 seconds. And let's see if this is fused well. not coming off anywhere, so that's a good sign, and there are no puckering, no bubbling on either of these pieces. So that looks pretty well fused. So let's go ahead and start our pocket flap sewing. Let's go ahead and do this curved one first. So basically, we're going to put face sides together. This is the under flap and this is the top flap. And right here I have the notches, and look at that, I didn't clip those before I brought them to the board, so I'm just going to clip these really quickly. These are our notches for the seam allowance, which is 1/4 inch. And I will match these face side to face side. And then we're going to stitch right around here all the way around. And I'll see you over at the sewing machine. Okay, so we're ready to sew the pocket flap together, and I have face sides together, and it typically doesn't really matter which side you choose to sew on. Generally, I like to sew the side that is larger, put that on the bottom, because the feed dogs actually help pull in that piece to fit in with the other piece. It kind of does a little gathering a little bit. It's easier to ease it in if it's slightly larger. And because this top piece is a little bit thicker, the under piece may have a tendency to slide away from you. So I'm going to put the under collar piece, the piece that is not fused, on the bottom, and I'm going to just match those up really nicely. Now we're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you may have noticed along the way, I don't use a lot of pins. Well, on these smaller pieces, I can kind of hold these together. And you'll notice that I'm actually using both hands to actually sew with. But I'll go ahead and pin these together for you so you can see what that would look like. If you need to use pins, by all means, go ahead and do that. For me, they are kind of a bit of a distraction, and I always have to worry about pulling them out. But let me just go ahead and pin this up for you. When you pin things together, make sure you're pinning perpendicular to the edge. That way it makes it easier to pull out. Okay, so we're gonna start with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fabric's underneath the foot, and I'm gonna start with a back stitch. And now I've got to take this pin out. Now we're coming up to the curve, so you want to get ready to turn that. And you don't want to be pulling it somewhat like this. You don't want to be stretching it. You want to make sure that you go around this curve in a very smooth action. Now, if you remember from your concentric circle, that once you start getting into tighter curves, you can actually turn down your stitch length to a smaller stitch, and that will actually give you a better line to sew with. It actually, you have smaller stitches, so you have more time to create that curve. I'm going to sew a few more stitches, and I'm going to turn my dial down a couple of notches, and then I'm going to start turning. Now it looks like I'm really holding this tight, but I'm really not. I'm just kind of holding it, and I'm getting ready to actually just slowly turn these pieces while maintaining my seam allowance. Take this pin out. So, and I've turned it down a couple of notches, so my SPI is a little bit shorter, so I can actually turn this. And be careful that you're not stretching your fabric to force it to go in there. If you're stretching the fabric, that means that the pocket is going to be stretched out, and the two ends of the pocket are actually going to show that on the outside, and we don't want that. So I'm just going to try to turn this equally, and I went a little fast there. When you get back to your straight line, you know, we're going to start sewing a straight line, you can actually turn your stitch length back up. And we're going to sew just before we get back starting to the turn, and I'm going to change the SPI back down a couple of notches. That will help me, give me a little bit more time to create this curve. And I'm going slow. And I'm back up to the straight part, so I'm going to put my SPI back to the regular stitch length. So when I'm coming to the end, I'm getting ready to backstitch. Okay, so one of the things that you're going to want to look at now that you're done is how even are your curves. Is this curve as even as this one? And sometimes you can turn it over and have a look while maintaining that seam allowance. It looks pretty good. So by turning down the stitch length, making the stitch length smaller along these curves, gives you a little bit more time to create that nice smooth curve. And then of course you want to come back to your regular stitch length to create that straight line. Now I'm going to go over to the press mat. We're going to trim this up a little bit and press it, and then we'll turn it face side out. Okay, so our pocket flap has been sewn, and now I just want to give it a quick press, and I'm going to press on the underside because I don't want any of that glue getting on my iron. So just give it a quick press really quick. Those stitches set. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to trim this. Okay, and I know I'm holding this in my hand, but just so you can see, I'm just going to trim this a little bit. About what we call a fat eighth. Just going to trim it around, and so what this will do is it will help the edges come out a little bit cleaner when we turn it right side out. All right. Now there's some other clipping we're going to do. So when we turn this inside out, there's going to be some bunching that happens around these curved areas. So we want to clip out some of those areas that might cause us to have some bulkiness. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very close to the stitch line at the center or apex of that curve is I'm going to clip little triangles out. And I'm going to do one at the top of the curve and another one here at the bottom of the curve. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So again, I've got one right at the middle of the curve and one at the top and the bottom of the curves, and I'm going to repeat that on the other side. And I'm getting pretty close to the stitch line, but I'm not actually hitting that stitch line. If you hit that stitch line, you may have to cut and sew another pocket flap. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now we can actually turn this right side out. Okay, and just take your fingers and just kind of roll that back and forth in your fingers, and that will help pull your fabric out. This one needs a little help. Out to the sides. And I'm just doing a rolling motion back on my hands. Just continue to do that until you feel like you've got that seam all the way worked out. And this muslin is pretty easy to work with because you can actually finger press it fairly easy. Once you have it to a place that you like and that seam looks like it is rolled out nicely, and you've got this pocket edge. I've got a little pointiness going on here. See if we can work that out. Then we're going to lay it, and I'm going to press it. Give it a nice little press there. Nice and round. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now what we're going to do is we're going to edge stitch maybe about an eighth, a 16th or an eighth away from the edge, all the way around. Okay, I'm ready to do the top stitching on the pocket flap here for the curved pocket. So this is the under flap, and we're actually going to do the top stitching on the top flap. That's why it's called top stitching, because it's done on the top. Now I know I mentioned at the pressing mat an 1/8 or a 1/16. We're actually going to do a 1/16. We're going to do it right here along this edge. That's going to be called edge stitching. And the reason I'm going to do that is because we're also going to do edge stitching to apply the pocket to the garment. So we want that stitching to match the pocket flap. Okay, so I'm going to put this under the presser foot and go just a little bit past the needle, and I'm just going to eye it as far as what a 1/16 is right here on the edge. I'm not going to backstitch because this part is actually going to be sealed once we sew this onto the garment, so a backstitch isn't really that necessary. But I am going to just start with the needle down, and I'm going to stitch right here on the edge. Try to make it consistent. Now understand, before when we got to this edge we turned the stitching down. We're not going to be able to do that on the top stitching because we don't want it to look different. We want all the stitching to be consistent. So we're just going to have to really take care to actually carefully turn this part into the needle. We don't want to stretch it, we just want to turn it into the needle. So I'm going to hold on to it with both hands. And the reason I'm doing it with both hands is so that I can turn up here, turn this part, and then with this hand I'm turning the bottom part. So I'm just going to take that and turn very gently as I sew. Right, and try to keep a consistent stitching speed if that will help you. This will probably take practice. And I'm going to do the same thing, turning the top and the bottom at the same time without any kind of stretching. If I can kind of work this a little bit more. And again, I'm not going to backstitch because it's not really necessary. And here's the finished edge stitching. It looks fairly consistent. Edge stitching right around. And then we're going to do one final press, and then we'll get to work on the actual pocket. Okay, so the pocket flap for the curved pocket is sewn, and I'm just going to give it one last press real quick. And then let's bring the pocket in here. We can set the flap aside. And this is the face side of the pocket. And what we're going to do, we're actually going to do a rolled hem for this. And so I'm going to flip it over to the wrong side, and I'm going to fold it on the notches and just press that. This is a 1-inch hem allowance. And if you have done the rolled hem exercises, you'll know exactly what we're doing here. So I've pressed that, and now at the machine, we're actually just going to roll that to the crease, roll it over one more time, and then top stitch this down right here at the edge. Alright, so we're ready to stitch our rolled hem for the top of our pocket. And again, I've pressed it, and now I'm going to fold this cut edge into that edge. And this is such a short length that you can roll the whole thing, and you can finger press it. That's what's so nice about working with muslin as a beginner, because everything, this muslin has a lot of body, so you can actually finger press it in place instead of pinning it. So I'm actually just going to stitch right here on the edge, maybe about a shy 1/16 away, and under the presser foot, a little bit past the needle down. And you can backstitch if you want. It's not really necessary because that's going to be enclosed. I did it anyway. And just stitch. Nice, easy stitching. And if you're going to backstitch, get ready to backstitch. And we're done. Okay, so the reason I said you don't really need to backstitch on either side is because there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance which we're going to tuck under here to actually top stitch it onto the garment. So it's actually, once you fold this and stitch across here, that's actually going to be securing those stitches from actually pulling out. So you can backstitch. I did it on both sides, but you don't have to. So let's go back over to the pressing mat and discuss how we're actually going to turn these rounded edges. Okay, so we have the hem on our curved pocket done. I'm just going to give it one quick press. And then we're going to kind of prepare this to apply it to the garment. So this is the face side. I'm going to turn it over to the wrong side. Now the idea is that we're going to actually turning up a 1/2 inch all the way around, and then we're going to top stitch it right onto the garment. So there are a couple of different techniques you could use to get this nice curve. The easiest way is actually to make a template, and that's what I've done here. So I've taken the pattern, and what I've done is I've traced the pattern, and then I've cut all of the seam allowances off. I've cut off the hem allowance, and then I've cut all of the seam allowances, and this is actually the finished size of the pattern. So what I'm going to do here is I will just kind of lie this on top of the pattern on the wrong side, and then I'll just make sure, and remember we cut off the hem allowance, so this will go straight up to the top of the pocket, and then I'll measure from side to side a 1/2 inch, because that would be my seam allowance, and it looks like I have this pretty good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to end up pressing this around, and notice you have all this extra fabric here, so this is would be the challenging part to actually sew on your garment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this part over, right, and then I'm actually just going to edge this up onto that template that I have while holding it in place. And I'm just kind of pressing it right around. Now the straighter edges are going to be easier. I'll hold this, then I want to do this side. Get that pressed over. And as I come around to these corners, what I'm doing is I'm just kind of pushing that fabric up onto that template. And what we'll be able to do at the machine is just tuck that right under while we're edge stitching. Now there are other techniques to get this done, but we will visit those in another level of sewing. Let me get these corners pretty good. Okay, so let's have a look. So we've got everything, it's starting to curl up. And if we look on this side, our curl is beginning. We can start flattening that down. So I'm going to bring over my garment, and I have the drill holes here. And in the industry, there would actually be holes. So whether or not you did this in the beginning or not, you would have actual holes in the garment. That's why I'm poking. You won't need to do these. I'm just showing you just for the exercise, but we have already marked those. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of want to mark a general amount. I have a 1/4 inch on either side of the notch, on the drill hole, and then a 1/4 inch above that. You can see this one looks a little off. I went too far. And we're gonna set the pocket right inside there. So normally you would just you would take this and approximately, this is where you would be setting, right? So there's equal distance on either side of those punch holes, and then equal distance above. And I've got that set. And then what we're gonna do is we're just gonna pin this right on the top. Okay, we've got a pin. I'm gonna pin this side to side. So I'm gonna start here on this side. So I'm gonna start sewing on right here, and I'm gonna go ahead and pin this side. Get this side pinned on. So I do it side to side, so just in case if I'm pinning all the way around here, that I don't get the pocket shifted. So this will keep the pocket, it's right at the top line where I need it to be nice and straight. And then I can kind of push this down a little bit. And I'm gonna pin this under the seam allowance just before the curve here. And I'm pinning in the direction of the sewing. And this is the direction I'm going to sew. So as I come up to the pin, I can easily pull it out. Now I'm going to just kind of tuck this under like we have it pressed. And I'm going to put a pin here just to hold a little bit of that fabric under. And then tuck that under, and then the straight part at the bottom of the pocket. Turn this around, be easier. Then I'm going to tuck this part under. And I'm going to pin just a little bit here in the corner of the curve. And then probably one right here at the side. Okay, so that's how our pocket is pinned. And now I'm going to actually edge stitch about a 1/16 away from the edge, just like we have on our pocket flap. We want the stitching to match about the same width, right, to match everything. So that's what we're going to be doing as we top stitch this on. Okay, so we're ready to sew our curved pocket onto our garment. This is the curved pocket. And we're gonna start right up here. We're gonna sew about a 1/16 away from the edge, just so it matches our pocket flap for this, right? I'm gonna remove this pin. I'm gonna repin it a little bit lower because see how bulky this is? It's hitting that hem, so I don't want it to cause any sewing issues. So I'm gonna just repin that just a little bit lower, so that I can get this stitching started right here, because I want to put the needle right in here, right at the top. And then hopefully I'm going to start with the back stitch, and I'm going to stitch, and then I'm going to come back, and my needle, I hope, is just going to be right on the other side of that edge. And I'll show you what that's going to look like once we get to the end. So I'm going to put my fabric under the presser foot, and before I put the presser foot down, I'm going to put the needle down. And I'm going to eye right under here, right under where I want that stitch line to be. That's where I'm going to insert the needle. So it's about a 1/16 away. So I'll insert the needle where I want to stitch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few stitches forward. I'm going to kind of count them in my head, and then I'm going to back stitch that same amount of stitches. So let's go. Let's do this. And now I can continue sewing. I'll remove these stitches. I'm going to go kind of slow on this pocket because I have a lot of pins that I'm going to be taking out, but also I've got to go around this curve down here, and I don't want to be stretching, so I want to go slow. That was not slow. So let's go a little bit slower, and I'll take out this pin, and I'm just going to remove the pins as I get really close to them. And I'm coming up to this curve, and if you remember me talking about the flap, I had a hand back here, and then I had a front hand, and I was turning the back fabric along with the front fabric, and that's what I'm going to do here. I'm getting a little bit closer. I'm going to take a couple more stitches, and then I'm going to remove this pin. It's pretty well pressed. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to turn equally so that I can manage to get around this nice curve. Nice and slow. And I'm holding on to everything. It looks like I'm holding it really tight to actually make it not so forward. But what I'm doing is I'm just kind of holding it, the pieces together, and then sliding it on the machine bed so that as I'm turning, it's being slid into that point while I'm watching where the needle is going in here. And I'm going really slow around this curve. And I can take this pin out. I'm going to come to the straighter part, which is a little bit easy. I'm coming back into this curve here. I'm going to remove this pin. And then I'm holding it again in both hands, and I'm doing this turn, a sliding turn as I go around this turn. Whoops. Gotta remove this pin. Then I'm coming back to the straighter part. Whoops, I got this pin going backwards. And now I'm coming up to the straight part. And I'm coming up to the end now. I want, see how I ended this part here, right? It's just right on the other edge of the hem fold. That's what I want it to look like when I end here. So as I come up to this ending part of the pocket, I'm going to slow down, and if I have to, I'm going to hand crank this needle. I'm right there on the edge, but I want one stitch right on this other side. So is that good? That's actually perfect. Needle down, and now the needle, I can show you, is right here, right on the edge of that fabric, right? It's not beyond, it's not up here in the garment. But now that the needle is in here, I'm going to press my reverse lever, and I'm actually going to reverse stitch. And then I'll bring a few stitches forward. And that will hold that pocket on very securely. Let's trim up our threads. And so there we have our pocket. It looks pretty good. Looks nice and even stitching. Okay, so we'll give this one press, and then we'll go over to the mat and we'll actually finish this up by attaching the pocket flap. Okay, so our pocket is sewn on, and I'm just going to give it a quick press, flatten everything out. And now we actually need to attach the pocket flap. Now remember, we have two sides. We have a top pocket flap and we have an under pocket flap. Remember that the top pocket flap is the side with the fusible on it. That's the side we want to actually be on the top when we get done. So that's why I marked two different markings. This is the underside. So we need to place this, center it with the pocket, and we're going to place this distance above the pocket opening. And I'm going to draw a line using my ruler. I'm going to go 3/8 of an inch. If I did a 1/4 inch, what's going to happen is we're going to sew this on a 1/4 inch and then turn it over and then top stitch it down. A 1/4 inch would be too close to this pocket edge. So I'm just going to give it a little buffer of 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to line up a 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to draw a line. And this is going to be our placement line for the pocket flap, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to center the pocket flap, and it should extend just a little bit past this pocket, just a little bit on either side. That looks pretty good. And it's lined up on my my placement line, and then I can actually pin this. Just a couple pins to keep it in place. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to sew this pocket flap to the garment 1/4 inch from this cut edge of the pocket flap. 1/4 inch all the way down. Okay, so I'm actually ready to sew this pocket flap to the garment. And again, it's going to be from this edge 1/4 inch. I don't need to mark anything. You can draw your 1/4 inch line if you want, but the edge of your presser foot is right here, is approximately 1/4 inch from the needle. So as long as you're running this edge along the edge of this presser foot, you should have a 1/4 inch. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to lift the presser foot. I'm going to put this, put the pocket flap under the needle, and I'm not going to start right here at this edge. Don't start here. Start in a little ways, just like we would normally start a regular seam. So I'm going to put it in a little bit so I can grab it, and then I'm going to back stitch, but only back stitch just past this edge here, okay? So because we don't want extra stitches past that pocket flap. So I put it in here a little bit, put the presser foot down, I can put the needle in. I'm going to remove this pin. And now I'm going to get ready to backstitch. So I'm going to sew and then backstitch, right? So you just have to eye it. I know I make it look easy, but it'll take a little bit of practice. If you go over too far, you can rip those stitches out. Just make sure that the remaining stitches on your pocket flap are still secure. So I'll sew the rest of the pocket flap on, following this edge right along the presser foot for that 1/4 inch. Take this pin out. I'm coming up here and I'm going to backstitch on this side as well. Ready to backstitch, and just one, just past it, and then a few stitches back. Now, if you can't manage to get your backstitch right on, let me show you here in just a minute. If you can't manage to get your back stitches right here where I've got it, you can stop and then hand turn the needle so it gets to that one point just beyond. So this is all sewn on. I'm just trimming up these extra threads. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go over, I'm probably going to trim this just a teensy bit, and then I'm going to turn this down, and we're going to do a 1/4 inch top stitch all the way across, and that's what's going to keep this flap from, flipping up like that. All right, so let's go back to the pressing mat. Okay, so we've got the pocket flap attached. I'm just going to do one thing. I just like to press after everything I've done. I just like to press it really quick. Now what we're going to do, we actually need to fold this over on our garment. We're going to do a 1/4 inch stitch line here to hold this down. But you know what? This is actually a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if I turn this over and I stitch it down at a 1/4 inch, sometimes what can happen is that we'll still see this cut edge. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab my scissors, and I'm just going to turn this up a little bit, and I'm just going to trim this edge just a teeny tiny bit, making sure I'm not going to be cutting the garment on the other side. So I'm just going to trim it just maybe like a 1/16 of an inch. And what that's going to do, that's just going to assure that when I sew, when I turn this over, and I'm going to kind of turn it here right at the edge here, and I think I'm just going to go, and now that I've got it turned, it looks great. Be careful that you're not pulling it like that, otherwise you'll get a little dimple. You just want to fold it over where it naturally wants to fold. And I'm actually just going to take the iron real quick, and I'm just going to lay the iron right on top of it just for a second, maybe 2 seconds. Okay, now that's nice and flat, and if you want to pin it, you can at approximately a 1/4 inch. I'll show you what the underside will look like if this is approximately a 1/4 inch. Okay, so when I flip it up, I don't see, if we did that real close, we would see some of that, but we won't see that now. So now we can go to the machine, finish this up, do our 1/4 inch stitching to hold this down right across the top. Okay, so we're ready to finish this up by top stitching the pocket flap down, and we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch from this folded edge. Now remember, we don't need to mark on here our stitch line, because right here the edge of the presser foot is our 1/4 inch line. So I'm going to actually just go and put this under the presser foot, lining up that edge a little bit in, just like I did with the previous stitching of the pocket flap. I'm going to go in a little bit from the needle, past the needle in. I'll remove this pin, and now I'm going to get ready to backstitch. And again, we just want to backstitch one stitch just past the pocket flap here, so we're going to be careful about that. So I'm going to take a stitch, and then I'm going to backstitch and go slow. And then I'm going to continue to sew. As you get close to the end, remember you can walk your needle. And I'm walking it quite a bit. Well, this needle will be on the edge. There it is, right on edge. Needle all the way down. Then I'm going to press the reverse lever and backstitch. Okay, let's see how we did. Let me clip these threads. Okay, let's have a look, see. Okay, we might be able to take one more stitch past that if we want to. Let's match the other edge. So I'm just gonna put another stitch there. I'll do that off camera, and then we'll have a look at it in assessment. But let's just give this one more final press before we go to assessment. All right, so we're ready to sew our western pocket flap. And if you notice on this pocket flap, we have a few pivots we're gonna have to do on both of the corners and down here at the point. So now we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so we're gonna have to find where the 1/4 inch right here. And I'm gonna say, let's cheat a little bit until we get really good at recognizing what a 1/4 inch on the pivot is. I'm going to use my ruler, and I'm actually just going to mark what the seam allowance is on these corners, so I know where I need to pivot. So right here, I've marked for my pivot point right there. And I'm going to do it for all 3 of those pivot points. So now, once you get used to what a 1/4 inch looks like, or if you have another garment you're working on that has 1/2 inch, until you get used to what those amounts are, you can, of course, draw those pivot points right in. Okay, so I've got all of my pivot points marked right in here. This is where we're going to pivot to make nice corners. Now, of course, I have my under pocket flap, and these are face side together. And it typically does not matter which side you're sewing on, the fused side, the top pocket, or the underside. However, because this has more body to it than this, I want to make sure that the under flap does not like slip away. And so the feed dogs will help keep that in place while I sew. And a lot of times I typically do not pin on pieces, small pieces like this, because I can hold it together with my hands, but I'm going to go ahead and pin it together so you can see that you can pin it together just in a few spots. Alright, so we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to sew all the way around this bottom edge of the pocket. And I'm going to start with a back stitch. Remove this pin. Now I'm sewing up, I'm getting close to my first point. As you're sewing, if you don't feel like you can stop exactly on that point, of course you can hand turn your needle and put your needle all the way down just like it's about to come back up, and that's when you can lift your presser foot to pivot. And you want to pivot in the direction of your sewing. So I'll remove this pin, and I'm going to sew down to this pivot point. And I'm going to hand turn right into that point. And if it looks like you're not going to make it exactly on that point, of course you can lift your presser foot a little bit and just kind of move or shimmy that until your needle hits right on that point. Your needle's going to go all the way down, and then just like it's acting just like it's going to start coming back up is when you can stop, lift the presser foot, and pivot back into that angle that you need to sew. And I'm going to sew up to my next pivot point. And I'm going to hand turn it right. It's like it made it pretty good on that point. Needle down, pivot, remove that needle, and I'm going to sew straight back up and get ready to back stitch at the end. And me move this. Let's trim these threads and let's have a look. Okay, so it's all sewn all around. I've got my pivot points. Let's see how well those stitches did on those pivot points. So this is what we want. We want a very nice stitch, right? We don't want a stitch that goes across. We're going to have a nice point there. We've got a nice point at the bottom and then a point right over here on the edge. That looks good. So we'll go over to the press mat, we'll trim this, and then we'll turn it right side out. Okay, so we have our western pocket flap sewn, and now we're just going to trim it up. And I'm going to take off, I'm going to trim it to, you know, what I call a fat eighth, all the way around. Now we have these corners, and when we turn this inside out, what happens is that there's going to be this fabric here that's going to get bunched up in the corner, and we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is very close here to that point. We don't want to be too close to it. I'm just going to clip a little bit away. Okay, so you still want to make sure that that stitch right here, you know, has fabric to hold on to. And I'm going to do that here at the bottom, and then again over on this corner edge. Okay, so that's really close but not on that stitch line. Now I'll turn this right side out. Okay, and I'm going to kind of get those corners to poke out. Now if you have a turner, you could use a turner to get point to your points. You could use your scissors or your snips, but if you use the snips, be very, very careful. I'm going to try using my machine screwdriver, and what I'm going to do is on this side, I'm actually going to put the screwdriver at this point, if I can get a hold of that, and I'm just going to push it right out. And with the screwdriver, because it has a nice corner here, I can slide it up on this side seam here, slide it up to the bottom, and then I can also slide it up from the side on the inside to get that fabric to actually poke out. And I'm going to do that the same thing on this side. Kind of get, again, the corner of my screwdriver at that corner, right? And I got my finger on the other side, so then I can just kind of push that through very gently, right? And work that corner a little bit. And then I'll slide that screwdriver up on that seam to be able to push that fabric a little bit further down. And then I'll slide, if you can see the inside, the bottom seam, I'm sliding that screwdriver up against that seam and just kind of pushing just a little bit more, being careful, and then it gives it a nicer point. Now here at the bottom, because it wasn't too angled, I'm actually just going to gently kind of pull that seam away, and this is that point, and I'll just kind of grab that, and I'll kind of finger press it to hold that in place. And then what I'm going to do with my fingers is just kind of wiggle that seam until it kind of folds nicely, and I see that seam. Just kind of wiggle it between your fingers. So of course muslin is easier to work with because it has a good body to it, and you can finger press it. If you had a lighter fabric, it may be a little bit more challenging. So let me clear the tools here from the pad. All right, so that looks pretty good. So I'm going to give it one press before we do our top stitching. All right, so we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to do an edge stitch right here, about a 1/16 away from the edge, all the way around. Okay, so we're ready to do the top stitching on our Western pocket flap. This is the under pocket flap and this is the top pocket flap, and we're going to do the top stitching on the top pocket flap. That's why we call it top stitching, on the top of the garment. We're going to do about a 1/16 from the edge. It's called edge stitching. So we're going to do right along here. And remember, we have 3 pivot points, one on either side and then one here in the center. And we want to try to make that consistent. So if it helps you, you can go ahead and mark with your erasable pen where those pivot points will be for you. That would be consistent with your edge stitching. Okay, that will just help you to identify where at the point you will need to stop and put the needle in and pivot. So I'm going to start sewing on this, put this under the presser foot, and I'm not going to backstitch because it's really not necessary. This part is actually going to be folded under and hidden once we actually apply it to the garment. So I'm just going to start here at the edge, push your fabric a little bit past the needle, and then put the needle down right there on the edge and just start sewing. And then when you start coming up to that pivot point, you may want to slow down a little bit. And if you need to turn the needle by hand to get it into that spot, and if it's not hitting that spot exactly, you could either put a stitch in and then remove the needle and then move it to where that spot is. And I'm just a little bit off. I'm going to lift the presser foot here and I'm just going to move it just a little bit and put that needle in where my point was. All the way down just about where it starts to come back up. Lift the presser foot and pivot in the direction you need to sew and continue sewing. Let's see where this needle's going to go. That one looks pretty good. All the way down. Let the presser foot pivot. And I'm just going to lift this up. It looks like the stitch is going to go over just a little bit, so I'm just going to lift the presser foot, pull that fabric back down a little bit, and then put my needle right in the spot where I need to pivot, all the way down. Lift the presser foot, pivot. And again, I don't need to backstitch at the end. All right, so there is my pocket flap, and I'm noticing something right away. So my stitching is a little bit irregular right here. So what am I going to do about that? Well, I'm actually going to rip this out and do it again. I won't do that on camera, but I'm going to rip it out from about here all the way to about here. And I'll start at the pivot point and re-sew this line and this line all the way back up to where my stitching was. And the reason I'm doing that is because this isn't consistent. So if once we got to assessment, I would actually circle this and I probably wouldn't give full credit on it because it's very obvious that the stitching is incorrect. So I'm actually going to rip this out and re-sew, top stitch this section here. Okay, so the Western pocket flap is done, and if you notice, I did correct this inconsistent sewing around here. Just make sure that when you do your sewing, if you actually see anything that's inconsistent in your sewing, don't continue, correct it at that point. Go back and do it over so that when you turn it in, if you were in school, you're not turning in inconsistent work. During the assessment phase of this project, if I saw that, I would have circled that and then not given full credit for it. So I went back and corrected that before the assessment. So I'm just going to give this one final press. And I can set that aside, and let's bring the Western pocket in here. So this is the face side, and what we're going to do here to finish off this edge is we're going to do a rolled hem. And if you've already done those exercises, you'll know exactly what we're doing here. So turn this to the wrong side, and I'm going to fold this back at the notches. And this is a 1-inch hem. We're going to do a rolled hem for this edge. And I'm just going to press that in place. Now at the machine, because I've got this nice pressed edge, what we're going to do is fold the cut edge right into that pressed edge and then fold it over again, and we're going to stitch right here on the edge. Okay, so we're ready to do this rolled hem on the Western pocket. I have this nice crease here, so fold those cut edges to that crease line and then fold it over again. And this is such a short length that you could probably just roll the whole thing and then finger press it down into place. So lift the presser foot, fabric in just past the needle, and we're going to stitch right here, skinny 1/16 away from that rolled edge. And you can backstitch if you want. It's not really necessary. I think I will, but I'll explain why it's not really necessary when I get done with this. So I'll start with the backstitch. Try to keep your stitching as consistent as possible. We're coming up to the end, so get ready to backstitch and backstitch. Okay, so we're done. Okay, so the reason that I said you don't really need to backstitch at the beginning and the end of this pocket hem is because the pocket has a 1/2-inch seam allowance all the way around, and we're going to press that over in just a minute. So because this is pressed around, we're gonna press this over a 1/2 inch. And then to apply it to the garment, we're going to be doing an edge stitch that crosses over this area here on the stitching. So because the stitching crosses over that, that will hold these stitches from unraveling. So it wasn't really necessary to backstitch, but it's okay if you did. So let's go over to the press mat and discuss pressing these over. Okay, so our pocket hem is done. I'm going to give that one quick press. And now we can actually prepare the pocket to actually be applied to the garment. So this is the face side. We're going to turn it over so we can see the wrong side. And each side of this, all 4 of these sides, have 1/2-inch seam allowances. So I'm going to turn that over each side a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to start with the sides, and you can use your ruler. And press each side separately. I'm going to do the 2 sides first. Now, if you can eye this at a 1/2 inch, great. I'm just going to double check this width. Now for the bottom point, it doesn't really matter which of these sides you fold over first, but make sure you're getting a 1/2 inch on either side. Depending on the look that you want. One side will have more of a thickness. I'm going to do this and then I'll show you. So make sure it's a 1/2 inch all the way down. And then we're going to do this one a 1/2 inch as well. That looks, let's see, that looks pretty good. So down here, what I was talking about, depending on the thickness of your fabric, Here it doesn't really matter a whole lot because this muslin is fairly thin, but if you have a very thick fabric, one side of this will kind of show a little bit more. So it depends on which side you want pointing in which direction. However, I would like to point out also, now that I've got all of my 1/2 inches around, this point here should be about the center, exactly the center, because both sides of these are a 1/2 inch and they will meet here at exactly the same height. So now that this is all nicely pressed, we can actually apply it to the garment. And I'm going to bring over my garment piece. And remember these 2 drill holes. Now in the industry, these would actually be holes. So I'm going to actually create holes here. And you could have done this when you cut out instead of marking. But we just wanted to be able to, as for the sample, just kind of mark with the pen. So what we're going to do, these are for the pocket placement, and our pocket is actually going to cover those holes. So there should be a 1/4 inch on this side and a 1/4 inch above. So that's how we should be placing this, and use your eye to look about what would a 1/4 inch width be and a 1/4 inch above. So let me fold this back. Does that look like a 1/4 inch? Okay, so I'm going to use a ruler. I'm going to mark my 1/4 inches. So I'm going to mark my 1/4 inch from those drill holes. And so you wouldn't normally do this in the industry, but I just want to show you where that placement would be. So here's my pocket. It fits right in a 1/4 inch on either side, and then a 1/4 inch above. And then we're going to just flatten this, right, and keep that flat. And this is where our pins come in. And I'm going to pin that pocket down to hold it in place, and I'm going to pin side to side instead of pinning all the way around. It will keep everything flat and straight. And I'm just going to put a pin here and a pin here. And notice that I'm pinning in the sew line. So this is going to be an edge stitch, and we're going to match the same edge stitch that we have for the pocket flap, approximately that same distance. And this is going in the direction of sewing, so I'll be able to remove these pins easy. And I'll have to remove them in order to stitch through. What I mean by pinning in the direction, the pins are going this way. I'm going to sew this way, pivot, 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 so I can pull these pins out in the direction of that sewing. So let's go ahead and top stitch this on. Okay, so now we're actually ready to top stitch the pocket, our western pocket, onto our garment. And as I did before, if you remember from the pocket flap, I actually marked where my pivot points were, and I have 3 on this pocket. I have 2 on either side and then 1 here in the center. And I'm not going to do that this time. I'm actually going to eye it. So let's start practicing eyeing where we actually need to pivot or where we need to sew instead of actually marking it. But I am going to start up at the top. Remember, I pinned in the direction of the sewing, so I can easily remove these pins as I sew. Before I remove this pin, however, I'm actually going to put the needle down right here up at this top point here, and I'm probably just going to move this pin just a little bit down from there, because I'm going to put the needle right there. So I think I'll repin this because it's moving down a little bit. So I'll just repin this, and I'm going to put the needle right there, and then I'll remove this pin to sew. So get this under the presser foot, and I'm actually going to leave the presser foot up, and then I'm going to turn and put the needle down first. I'm going to kind of look here underneath the foot, about a 1/16 away. Remember, we want it to match the pocket flap as closely as possible. So I'll put the needle down, then I can put the presser foot down, and I'll take the pin out. And I'm going to back stitch at the beginning, so I'm going to do a couple stitches and then back stitch. Right? Because I want this corner, these corners are going to have to be very secure. And then I'm just going to stitch all the way down, and I'm going to eye where I need to stop and pivot. My pivot point is going to be right about here. So I'm going to keep sewing till I get close and try to make your stitch line as straight as possible. I'm getting close, so I think I'm going to hand turn. Whoa. And it looks like I've gone maybe a little bit too far, so before I put that needle in, I'm going to lift the presser foot. I'm going to back off just a little bit and then put that needle in where I think it needs to go. Needle down, presser foot down, up, and then I'm going to pivot. The reason I put the presser foot down is because I want to make sure that that thread knows that it's down there instead of being twisted around the needle. So I'm going to turn this in the direction I believe I need to be sewing as far as the width. Take that pin out, and then my next pivot point is right up here at this point here. And I'm going to sew, getting close to that pivot point. I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to hand turn. I'm going to look, is that close enough to where I need to be? I'm going to kind of just put the needle in there, maybe look underneath. You probably won't be able to see it in the camera, but I'm going to point to where. So this is the actual point. And the needle is a little bit shy from meeting where the point is exactly in the center. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put the presser foot down, lift the needle, and start getting the needle to go down, but I'm not going to put it in the fabric. I'm going to put it just above the fabric. Then I'm going to lift the presser foot, and I'm going to just kind of look and see under here. This is the point where I'm just going to look where that needle is right here. Is it with that point? And I think I'm pretty darn close. So now I will put the needle down in, presser foot down, and just about as the needle starts to come up, I'm going to stop, lift the presser foot again, and pivot. Take this other pin out and sew in the direction that I need to sew. Coming up to our last pivot point, we'll do the same thing. Is that close enough? I think I'm just a little bit shy, so I'm just gonna there we go. And then pivot. Now this pin was going the opposite way, so I'm gonna stitch up. And now when we come up to the end of this pocket, look at what we did here. I have several stitches when I first began, and I got it right on there. So I don't like any stitches coming up past this pocket part. So one stitch just beyond that would be great. So what I'm going to do is I'm coming up to the end of this pocket edge, real close. I've got one stitch. I'm going to hand turn this needle, and I'm going to see, well, it's not quite one stitch. I'm going to move that so the stitch goes just on the other side of that top. Put the needle down all the way. And then what I'm going to do is, because the needle is right here, right on this edge, I'm going to reverse stitch. I'm going to back stitch instead of going forward again. Back stitch, and then bring those stitches back. Let's clip this, and now I'll show you what I did. Now at the beginning it's hard to do that, but I got it right on at the beginning. This is what you want it to look like, and see at the end I also have it looking exactly like that up there. Okay, and let's have a look at that point that I was very careful about. It looks pretty good. It looks like my stitch was right on point there, so that's some pretty nice work. So we've got our pocket, our western pocket, sewn onto our garment. Let's finish this up by applying the pocket flap. Okay, so we have our western pocket attached to the garment. I'm just going to give it a quick press really quickly. Keep everything nice and flat. And now we can start talking about attaching our pocket flap. Now remember that the pocket flap has a top pocket flap and an under pocket flap. And the top pocket flap is what's going to be seen on the outside, and that has the fusible on the inside. So when it's finally finished, we want the pocket to look like this. So when we attach it to the garment, we're actually first going to sew it like this, and we can see the underside. So to do this, we're actually going to draw a placement line above this pocket edge here. Now I'm going to do 3/8. If I did a 1/4 inch, I'm going to show you what that would look like. If I did a 1/4 inch like I have here, I could sew it on, and then I would sew this on at a 1/4 inch and then turn it over and top stitch it down. But that top stitching to keep this pocket flat would actually be too close to this pocket edge. So I'm going to give it about 1/8 of an inch buffer. So I'm going to mark up from that pocket edge 3/8, and I'm just going to draw a placement line. So there's my placement line. Then I'm going to take my pocket flap. This is the top. So I'm going to flip it over so I can see the underside, and I'm going to line it up evenly. It should come over the pocket. The edges should come over the pocket slightly a little bit. And then with that, I'm going to line it up where my placement line is. So I'm going to pin this in place. And these edges extend just slightly. The pocket flap edges extend slightly over this pocket. That's just to cover the pocket edge, so we don't accidentally get something like this or that. Right, we don't want to see the pocket edges. So now that I've got that pinned on, what I'm going to do is right here, I'm going to take it over the machine, and from this edge, I'm going to stitch this down a 1/4 inch from this edge all the way along the pocket. Okay, so I'm ready to sew this pocket flap onto the garment. And remember, we're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from this cut edge. And we don't need to mark this because we know that from the needle, this edge of our presser foot is actually a 1/4 inch. So we can just run this cut edge here along the side of the presser foot. I'm going to repin this in the beginning just quickly to show you because that's too close to where the beginning is. And I'm going to actually, when you put this under the presser foot, you want to put the needle in a little bit down. Don't start right here at the edge because it may not take all that fabric right away. So I'm going to put it in a little bit past the needle, just like we start any regular seam. And I'll put the presser foot down and then the needle in. Now I'm going to take a stitch and then probably back stitch. And my back stitch is going to come just to the other side of the pocket. Try not to stitch too far. I know we're still getting used to back stitching. If you go too far, you can rip those stitches out because you're going to be stitching back over. But just make sure if you do that the stitches right at the edge of that pocket flap are still secure. So let's see how I do this. I'm going to sew and then get ready to back stitch right away. And as you get more practice, you'll be able to eye that. It just takes a little bit of practice. And now I'm just going to run this edge along the presser foot. That's my 1/4 inch. And I'm going to take this pin out. And I'm going to coming up here where I need to actually backstitch. And I don't want my stitching to go beyond the edge of the pocket flap. So either I can eye this, I'm getting pretty close, so I'm going to hand turn. That's just right in there, so I'm going to let the presser foot move it just a little bit so I've got just on the edge of that presser foot needle all the way down. And instead of sewing forward, I'm going to press the reverse lever and I'm going to back stitch right away. And that's all I need to do. Let's take this out and have a look at it. I'm just trimming up these threads. All right, so that looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go back over the press mat and I'm just going to trim this up just a little bit. We're going to fold this down and then we're going to do another row of 1/4 inch stitching right across here. And what that does, that will keep that from flipping up like that. All right, so let's go back to the press mat. Okay, so we've got the pocket flap sewn to the garment above the pocket, and I'm just going to do a quick press. I like to press after every time I sew. Just keeps everything manageable and nice and neat. Now, what's going to happen is we're actually going to turn this down, and then we're going to do a 1/4 inch stitch here. If I do a 1/4 stitch from this folded edge across the top of the pocket, we may end up seeing some of this cut edge and some of these threads that are hanging off because this is also a 1/4 inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim a little bit of this off. So I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm just going to flip this up And I'm going to make sure that I don't cut any of that garment, right? It doesn't matter which side you start on. So I'm just going to hold this. And I'm going to take off maybe just a little bit of a 1/16 off of that edge. And that will just kind of keep everything hidden when I top stitch that 1/4 inch. So let's have a look at that. So when I turn this over now, what I want to do is I want to fold this over. Try not to pull it like this and get it sewn. What will happen is you'll get these little dimples if you fold it too far. So you just want to gently fold it over at that seam, the way it naturally kind of wants to fall in place. And then once you have a nice fold, that looks pretty good, I'm going to take the iron. I'm just going to put the iron on it for just a second or two. Just to keep it down, keep a nice fold there. And then here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually pin across so you can see about a 1/4 inch from that edge, because we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch down from this folded edge. And then let's have, well, that's a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. That looks a little bit better. Okay, and then if I fold this back, you can see that everything is going to be completely hidden in, right? And I have enough space between the top of the pocket and the pocket flap to get my hand in there or anything else I need to put in there. All right, so now we're ready to go to the machine, finish this up, and do our top stitching across. Okay, so we're ready to finish up this pocket by stitching the pocket flap down. And we don't need to mark our 1/4 inch stitch line because this edge here, this is what we're going to use as a guide, and it's 1/4 inch from here. And remember that our presser foot from here to the needle is 1/4 inch. So we can just run this edge along the side of our presser foot. So again, when I put the fabric underneath the presser foot, I'm going to start in a little bit past the needle. Then I can put the needle down and the presser foot down, and I'm going to remove this pin here. Now I'm going to sew a stitch and then I'm going to back stitch, and we want to remember that we only want to go 1 stitch just past on the other side of the pocket flap back here. So if we stitch too far, we can rip those stitches out. Just make sure that this edge of the pocket flap is very secure. So I'm going to sew a stitch and then back stitch. Running the top of the pocket flap alongside the presser foot. Remove this pin. Continue on coming up to the end. We just want this 1 stitch past this if you need to turn. I'm going to get a little bit closer. Then I'll turn. Am I going to get that? Well, it's awfully close, so I'm going to lift up and I'm going to place that needle. Move it just past that. Needle all the way down, and then I'm going to actually press the reverse lever and I'm going to back stitch over that section. Right? All right. So now let's take this out and let's see what we have. Make sure you trim out all your threads so you don't have to do it all at the end. All right, so my pocket flap is on. I look pretty good here. I can trim off that. So, right, everything looks pretty good here, equal on either side. So let's give it one final press and then we'll go to assessment.